Many years ago, in the middle of the 20th century, America asked a young man to go to war. It was the time of the Second World War. The United States was engaged in World War II from December 7th, 1941 until August of 1945. It was a conflict which left few places on earth untouched. It was fought on all the oceans, in all the skies, on tropical islands, and in ancient cities. When that young man went off to war, he left his home, his family, his school, his job. He didn't know it at the time, perhaps, but this ordinary, everyday American, and millions like him, were being asked to save the world. This young man became a member of the U.S. Navy. In this war, the oceans of the world were critical battlefields. Men struggled on the sea and under the sea, from the warm waters of the South Pacific to the cold, gray waters of the North Atlantic, and all the oceans in between. I believe we owe that Navy veteran, your family's veteran of World War II, an enormous debt of gratitude. We should never forget his courage, his sense of duty, his sacrifice. His contributions made possible the freedoms in life we all too often take for granted. I was a correspondent during that war, the last war in which great navies fought great sea battles. Despite all that's happened in the years since, I can assure you nothing's made a bigger impression on me than the willingness of those young American soldiers and sailors to go beyond the call of duty. Because of their determination, America itself was changed, and the world as we know it today was born. I consider it a great honor to introduce the story your veteran will tell of his contribution to America's role in World War II. It's his story, told by him in his words, and it's a part of American history. Listen to this story and remember it. He's dedicating it to you, his family, and to all his descendants. This is the best part of our nation's heritage. It's real. It's the story of one veteran, one of those everyday heroes who saved the world. Honor him as I do.
This is the word Kasala, and at the present time I'm living in Grafton, Wisconsin, in a small apartment that I bought, and I moved into a smaller place because my wife passed away about 6-7 months ago, so I didn't need a big place anymore. But all I can think of to say is they asked me what my rank was. Well, I was a second-class fire controlman in the Navy. It was mostly all my time, in fact, was in the Navy, and like I said, I was a second-class fire controlman. And for those people that don't know what a fire controlman is, they seem to think that you controlled fires on board ship, which had nothing to do with fires. All we had to do was take care of all of the guns, directors, power drives, and we had to know a lot of electricity, and a lot of the gunners made duties in the gun stations, because if one of them were killed or injured or anything, we were supposed to be able to take over their duties. And I served on several different ships. I served on a fleet oiler, which was AO-59, USS Mississinawa, and on an APA-139, which was an attack transport. Pretty much spent most of my life in Racine, Wisconsin, until I met my wife, and then I lived in Crandon, Wisconsin, which was my wife's hometown. And growing up, it was depression. It wasn't the best of times. I know I used to have to go to work during vacation time. We didn't have much vacation, but when I was about 14 years old, I used to go out to truck farms and help them harvest their stock. And it wasn't very much money. We used to get 5 cents a bushel for picking onions, 10 cents a bushel for seed onions, because they were mighty small. And I spent all my time in Racine, going to school. And after I got married, we moved back to Racine, and I worked at Gordon Machine Company, which was a machine or company that made milling machines and engraving machines. I also went to Washington Park High School and just had general studies, but mostly I concentrated on manual skills. Just normal life for a kid in the city that didn't have much money at that time. But we enjoyed listening to the radio, enjoyed fishing because we lived right on Lake Michigan, and used to watch movies once a week at Saturday when it was a 5-cent day. And when we used to go setting pins in a bowling alley, then we'd get to bowl every once in a while. I had quite a few friends in our neighborhood there. One of them I've known him since we were in 6th grade. This fellow by the name of Mel Pearson. And then I had a couple of Wiesner brothers and Joe Crispy and Sig Valegi. They were all in our neighborhood there. And we had a great time growing up together. Got in the same troubles that all kids get into. So, in that respect, no different than anybody else. Well, after growing up in Racine, I met my wife when I went on vacation. And we got married. And about 14, 15 months later, we had a little girl. And just about the time that she was supposed to go into labor, I get a notice from the government that they want to see me. So I went to the draft board and I explained to them that my wife was just about ready to deliver. So they were kind enough to give me 6 weeks, which would give me enough time to get our affairs wrapped up and get her back to Crandon, where she had folks living up there. And at least the rentals, things up there were a little cheaper than in a place like Racine, and she would have her folks nearby and get a little bit of help. So after that came about May 5th, I think, is when I was taken to for my examination. And that's a dehumanizing thing, running around all day with no clothes on, and from doctor to doctor, and all the men around you, all sizes, shapes, colors, the whole bit. But I guess you get used to it after a while. It's a good thing I did, because that's about all you had on board ship. And I was taken to basic training in Great Lakes Naval Station. After 6 weeks of boot camp, we were given a test, and which was to classify us as to what we were best suited for. And luckily, my training in high school with electricity and stuff, I was able to pass the test for fire controlman, which I felt kind of fortunate in the fact that out of the 100 and some men in our barracks, there was only 2 of us made fire controlmen, so I felt pretty good about that. Boot camp was tough at first. You did a lot of stuff, like getting up 6 o'clock in the morning and running down to the lake bank, running up and down lake bluffs, and but after a while you toughened up. I imagine that was probably about the best shape my body was in for years. Well, some of the fellows that I had met during training were Oliver Fuller and Carl Hintz, Roy Grzana. In fact, Oliver Fuller was the other one that made fire controlman with me. And luckily, after the war, we all were from Milwaukee, and we soon found each other's out and our wives, and we used to get together for weekly poker games and go to different functions together, which made it nice. We could hash over the old times. And most of our barracks, we had 2 floors. The first floor was all guys from around the Milwaukee area. And the second floor was all different fellas from New York, New Jersey, and we didn't get along with them too well. They seemed to think that we were nothing but a bunch of hicks and a bunch of farmers, so they didn't have much use for us. So we didn't bother with them too much. So after basic training, we went to fire control school, and that was 6 weeks at Great Lakes. And after we finished there, we got a promotion, and we were assigned to advanced fire control in San Diego. So that's the first long trip I had ever been away from home. I never was any further away from home than Crandon, Wisconsin, which was about 200 miles away. So it was quite an experience, taking the train out there and spending time out in California. Never used to have nice weather like that around Wisconsin. That was another 8 hours a day, 6 weeks, but more advanced. In fact, it was to the point where you had to learn different ships of the Japanese fleet and their planes, so you would be able to identify them and not shoot down some of our own planes. So that got to be pretty interesting. And then after that fire control school, we were given what they called long travel time. So I was able to stop off and see my wife and my daughter, who at that time was just starting to walk, which I enjoyed very much. So then on to New York, and right out of Baltimore, we picked up the ship there and took it on a breakdown cruise. And we didn't know too much about the Navy or what a fleet oiler did, was just accept what we'd hear from guys, and that was usually in a ribbing way. They would tell us how much oil and gasoline we were carrying, and boy, we were a good target. And well, as it turned out, I guess we did turn into one. After we got the ship picked up and went to take it on a shakedown cruise, then we headed south. And I remember going past the Statue of Liberty, and thing that came to mind there was both my mother and my father came from Czechoslovakia, and they came over on the boat, and it just passed through my mind. I thought, I wonder what they thought when they passed that Statue of Liberty on their way from the old country to this country. And so it kind of made it a little bit more personal in that respect. After we left there, we started heading to Aruba, South America, where we picked up our first load of oil, both crude oil and diesel oil, and high-octane gasoline for planes. And then on through the Panama Canal, which was quite an experience. Quite nice to watch the way they get these big ships through there. I often wondered how they ever got those aircraft carriers through there, but I guess they did. And after going through the Panama Canal, we headed north to go to San Francisco, and that's where we were going to pick up the rest of our crew. But before we got there, all of a sudden, we had general quarters, and that shook us up a little bit. And then we found out that a sub had been trailing us, and a destroyer headed back there and started dropping some depth charges, and it was at that time that I guess everybody on board ship had about the same feeling that I did, was, well, the game's over now. This is all for real. You better wake up to the fact that anything can happen from now on. I guess that was pretty much the feeling of all of the fellas. Well, after our general quarters to do, we headed on up to San Francisco, and we picked up the rest of our crew. And I had another fire controlman come aboard, and 2 strikers. A striker is somebody that's in training to be a fire controlman. So we had 4 in our bunch to take care of all of the equipment that we were supposed to take care of. And then it was heading west, heading west. I spent all my time in the South Pacific. We've been to pretty much everywhere. We went to Inuit, Hawaii, Guam, New Guinea, Philippines, Coral Sea, Hollandia, around Philippines. We went to Manila, Legazpi, roamed around Subic Bay, and we refueled many times for ships that went to Tarawa and Saipan. So we were never involved too close to those islands because well, we were too easy a mark, I guess. Being away was starting to get to most of the fellas. You're busy all the time during the day, but then when you're off watch, that's what gives you the time to sit around and I would say lonesome. And of course, with me, I was missing my wife and watching my daughter grow up. And kind of worried about my wife having enough money to support her and the baby. And with each promotion that I had, I was sending her home bonds and in different allotments. The first one I sent was a $25 one, and then another $10 one. And so I guess between that and the bonds and a little help from her parents, I guess she got along all right, which I'm thankful. She did a good job of bringing up that daughter of mine, and I'm thankful every day now, because without my daughter now, with my wife gone, I don't know what I'd do. She's been in a fill-in spot, filling up the gap in my life now, and I can't be more thankful to my wife for giving me a baby like that. And most of the times when I was gone, I used to write my wife pretty often. She used to write to me pretty nearly every day. Of course, being from a small town, she used to say she didn't have much to tell me. But I used to write her, and of course, the first couple letters she got been chopped up by a censor. It looked like shredded wheat. And then finally we got to a point when I did get back after our survivors leave. We had hooked up a code, so in the way I opened my letter would tell her where I was. So in that way, I guess we fooled the censor. Maybe it was illegal, but at that time I didn't care. And once in a while I'd get letters from my sisters, but not very often. They were both still single. I was out of 4 kids in our family, and I was the youngest. I was the only one married. The rest of them were all single. So they had their own lives to live. I guess they didn't spend too much time writing letters. Okay, as far as any real combat, we were never involved too much with landings on the AO. We were pretty far back. We'd refuel the fleet and aircraft carriers and so on. then they would head up ahead of us, and we would stay back with our test group. And so the day that we went to WWII is, in fact, if I remember correctly, I read a little book that some fella had written about suicide squadrons, both the planes and the submarines. And as far as I know, they had planned to come into that place with 2 motherships, and each of the motherships had 3 of the mini subs with them, and they were supposed to hit us at 6 o'clock in the morning, I believe it was. And in fact, I tried to look for that book, but I couldn't find it. But there was a fella in there, I even had his name. And these little subs left the mothership, and they went into the atoll, and they were supposed to start at 6 o'clock in the morning. Well, this overeager lieutenant blew the whistle on him, and he let go and hit us at 5:45, and that really screwed it up for the rest of them. And once that went, the other ones started scattering, and the destroyers picked them up. From what I hear, that they got all the mini subs that were in the atoll, and they trailed the mothership, and I don't think they ever got her, because I remember reading something about I think it was the 36, and their number 36 mother sub that came back to Japan and gave the Japanese a big story about how they hit the Navy at WWII and sunk a battle wagon and a destroyer and a cruiser and 2 aircraft carriers. Oh, they had a big story about it. And as it turned out, there was only 1 ship lost there, and that was us. And got kind of a charge out of that. And anyway, that morning, it was 5:45, like I say, and I was in bed and fast asleep, and all of a sudden it just jarred the whole ship. A big boom, and knocked me right out of my bunk. And of course, right away I had to run up the ladder and see, and all I saw was smoke and fire, and I thought, uh-oh. So luckily I didn't panic. I quickly ran to the aft part of the ship where the 5-inch gun director was, and that's where my life jacket was. I had a life belt on that we always wore, but I figured I want my life jacket, so I ran back there and got it, and then had to go up two decks, and there was one part of the ship, the aft quarter, from about a third of the way from the aft end of the ship around to the rear end. That water was clear. Otherwise, all the way around us, the water was on burning. It was just burning like crazy. And so we had to jump. And I think it was about, maybe 60 feet to the water. And we were told how to hold on to our life jacket and all when we jumped. And as it was, some of the fellas panicked. Some of them jumped off the ship without anything. And luckily, a couple of them, one fella was a black fella, and another one was a white fella, and they didn't have any. So what they did was they kind of hung on to my life jacket and paddled with their other arm. And between the three of us, we made enough headway, so we got through where the water was burning, and we were picked up by a lifeboat from one of the other fleet oilers, our sister ship, in fact. Her name was the A.O. Smith, or A.O. 58, A.O. Smith, the company in Milwaukee. And unknown at the time, one of the fellows that I went through boot camp with was on that ship, but we never knew about that until we met each other later. Anyway, I will say that's about the most scared I was in my life. And I'm not afraid to say I prayed like mad, and I guess the good Lord saw fit to let me get out of there, for which I'm thankful. And we got picked up by this other ship and stayed aboard her for a couple days. We all had to get new dungarees and shirts because we were just all oil soaked, and our clothes were a mess. One good thing I will say, that other ship, their captain was nice enough so that everybody that came aboard from out of the boats, he gave them a shot of brandy, which I thought was unusual for the Navy, but we got it. So I meant to mention before that while we were on board the A.O. 58, which was our sister ship, we got our clean clothes and all, and we all stood there and watched our ship burning, and watched the gun forward and aft magazines blow up, and surprisingly it still stayed afloat. We couldn't figure out how come, but anyway, she's laying down on the bottom now, so I don't think there's much left of it after blowing up the center at first, and then 2 times after that. Anyway, it was quite a thing to go through. I'm thankful I made it through. And of course, then it's I guess thing to do is after that I went on to an APA, and surprisingly we got a survivor's leave. 3 weeks I think I was home, and that's when my little daughter was really getting up to being a little girl. I wanted to add about being on the APA. That was a different experience again. There I was almost like a secondary gunnery officer. We only had one aboard ship, and he would run things, and I would have to stand his station up there on the signal deck when we were underway, and didn't have much to do on board that ship. We did enjoy it to the fact that we would pick up some of these troops, like we had picked up a flock of Marines, and Swabbies and Marines didn't get along very good, and they kept riding us. Well, thankfully we hit real rough weather between California and Hawaii. We were taking them to the Philippines, and we hit bad weather, and they were sick, and I mean really sick. And I guess we enjoyed that more than anything, to see them laying around in their own vomit and washing all over them when the water would slosh over the deck. And so we reminded them that a day or so later, some of them were sick all the way over to Hawaii. Anyway, we were never in much too close to any of the action, because our landing craft would load up with men and head for shore, and we stayed pretty much out of gun range. And we had enough planes and heavy-duty ships around to protect us, so it wasn't as, well, I shouldn't say exciting. It wasn't as hair-raising as the last ship I was on. This was a little bit more that, well, I should say a little calmer living. All I can say is that I was glad. I was glad when it was announced. In fact, we heard it right after it happened, when the atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. And we thought, oh boy, good, now we're getting even. And then when it was announced and I found out I had enough points to get out, I could hardly wait to get back to the States. It was one marvelous thing in my life. Anyway, when I got back, it was nice. Of course, it was nice to get back to the States. And one thing I forgot to mention, though, that when our ship had been sunk, the oiler, they had never announced anything in the papers. And we had already come back on the USS Wichita, which was a cruiser. And we got ashore, and what greets us on the shore is newspapers with USS Mississinoa sunk. And we hadn't been in contact with our family. Boy, it was a mad scramble to get a hold of our parents and my wife and daughter to tell them that I was all right. Luckily, my wife lived in a town where there was only a weekly newspaper. But my sisters, and they were in a bigger town, and they saw it right away. So I hurriedly called them and let them know right away. And then I had time at my leisure to let my wife know without having her worry about it. So I wanted to bring that in. I had forgotten to talk about that. Only thing that I can think of that after I got out was the attitude of some of the people. You know, we were so glad to finally whip them. In fact, when I was there in Tokyo, we were there about 2 weeks after it was signed, and I had shore patrol that day, and it kind of griped me to walk along there and having these people bowing to you and kowtowing and making believe like you're the second coming. And I guess it's true nowadays in that in Hawaii at the memorial to the Arizona, a friend of mine went there and he bought a relic, some little memento of the USS Arizona, and guess what was stamped on the bottom? Made in Japan. I thought that was pretty ironic. Another thing that kind of got me was when we got home, one of the first things that really got me mad is I was sitting on a bus, and there was a woman sitting behind me with a friend of hers, and she was complaining to this woman about how she was mad because the war didn't last a little longer because she had such a good paying job, and now she wouldn't be able to work anymore. So I guess it takes all kinds to make a nation, but it sure gets me when I listen to something like that. And I want to dedicate this to my wife, who I said just passed away just before our 58th anniversary. And also my daughter Sandra, whose family has given me 4 grandchildren, and one of the grandchildren and his wife have given me twin great-granddaughters, for which I'm thankful. So I want to dedicate this tape to them. So that'll be it. I guess that's all for now that I can think of.